Lucas Marshall, a wealthy and arrogant businessman, lived by his own rules, but when he accepted a bet that seemed harmless, something happened that no one could have predicted. Stay tuned because this story will surprise you. The sky above the city was clear and icy cold. The light of the full moon reflected off the towering glass skyscrapers as though the heavens had merged with the skyline. From his penthouse, Lucas Marshall looked down upon this world of steel and glass, a world he had conquered. He took a sip of his bourbon, the golden liquid glowing softly in the dim light. Behind him, the room buzzed with laughter and conversation, his friends, business partners, and admirers. Everyone wanted to be near Lucas, even if it meant putting up with him. "Lucas," began Richard, an old friend who always drank a little too much and said a little too much. "You have everything, an empire that bears your name, a list of awards longer than this building, and more power than most politicians. But do you know what you don't have?" The atmosphere in the room shifted. The laughter faded. Everyone turned to look at Richard, waiting for the next challenge, and at Lucas, whose icy smile made it clear he didn't appreciate such remarks. "What I don't have," Lucas repeated mockingly, tapping his glass against the edge of the table. "Tell me, Richard, what's missing in my oh-so-complete life?" Richard leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Someone who cares about you, someone who sees you, Lucas, not just the money and the power. Everything you have, you can buy. But the things that truly matter, those can't be owned." The room fell even quieter. Lucas grinned, his teeth white and hard as marble. "I don't have time for that sentimental nonsense," he replied with a tone laced with mockery. "I'm building something bigger than feelings, Richard. Love, loyalty, care, those are just bargaining chips, and I buy what I need." But Richard didn't back down. He took another sip of his whiskey and smiled faintly. "I don't think you can do it, Lucas," he said. "I don't think you can find someone who trusts you without your money, or someone you trust." Lucas's grin disappeared, and his eyes grew darker. "Are you saying that's a challenge?" he asked slowly. "Maybe I am," Richard answered casually. "Here's my proposal. Find someone who has nothing. Prove that you can create more than a transaction, that you can build a connection." Lucas leaned back in his chair as the silence in the room grew heavier. "You know I don't like to lose," he said quietly. His friends held their breath. They knew Lucas. When he accepted a challenge, it was always to win. "Give me a month," he continued, "and I'll show you I can do more than close deals." The room buzzed with murmurs again, but Richard said nothing more. He knew he had set something in motion, something Lucas himself might not fully understand yet. A week later, Lucas drove through the city in his black sports car. The rain tapped rhythmically against the windows as he aimlessly passed through the streets. It wasn't his habit to wander, but Richard's words still echoed in his mind. Someone who has nothing. What did that even mean? Everyone had a price, and Lucas was used to paying whatever it took. He stopped at a red light and leaned back in his seat. His gaze drifted to the wet sidewalk across the street, where a woman was crouched down. Her coat was worn, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. But it wasn't her miserable state that caught his attention. It was her focus. She held a pencil in her hand, sketching on a pad of paper as if the rain didn't exist. Her face was soft, concentrated, completely absorbed in her own world. "Who does this in the rain?" Lucas muttered, unable to look away. The light turned green, and the car behind him honked impatiently. Reluctantly, he drove on, but the image of the woman stayed with him. Someone who had nothing, yet poured herself so fully into what she was doing, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. The next day, Lucas sat at his desk, his thoughts far from the work in front of him. The image of the woman kept returning. By midday, he'd had enough of his own distraction. He pressed the intercom button. "Bring the car around," he told his driver curtly. He drove back to the same street, the sound of rain still a constant companion. To his surprise, the woman was there again, in the exact same spot. The same coat, the same focus, as if time had stood still. Lucas parked and stepped out, the water splashing under his leather shoes. He crossed the street, his gaze fixed on her. Just when you thought he might hesitate, he leaned down toward her. "Hey," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the rain. The woman looked up, her eyes sharp and intense, despite the rain streaming down her face. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly, without a hint of politeness. Lucas smiled faintly, the challenge glinting in his eyes. "I want 5 minutes of your time, that's all." "Why?" she asked, setting her pencil down. "People like you never want something for nothing." Lucas leaned casually against a lamppost, watching her closely. "Maybe I just want to know why someone chooses to sketch in the rain." She looked at him with suspicion, but something in his tone stopped her from walking away immediately. "You've got 5 minutes," she finally said, "but if this gets weird, I'm leaving." Lucas smiled. That sounds more than fair. What he told her next would turn her world upside down and change his own far more than he ever expected. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries hung in the air as they entered the cafe. The woman lingered near the door, her eyes darting quickly over the tables and the people deep in conversation. Her posture was tense, as though she might bolt back outside at any moment. "Here," Lucas said, pointing to a table in the corner. He walked there purposefully, as if certain she would follow. After a brief hesitation, she did. Lucas ordered 2 cups of coffee, slid one steaming cup toward her, and leaned back in his chair. The woman sat upright, her back stiff and her gaze locked on him. She didn't touch the cup. "Okay," she began, her voice firm and cold. "What is this? Why am I here?" Lucas took a sip of his coffee and looked directly at her. His eyes met hers, and for the first time his usual confidence seemed to give way to something else. "My name is Lucas Marshall," he said calmly, his voice just a fraction softer than usual. "I'm a businessman, and I'm looking for someone who can help me accomplish a goal." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Help? With what exactly? And why do you think I can do that?" "Because you have nothing to lose," Lucas answered without hesitation. His tone was firm, but not harsh, as though he were stating a simple fact. "I know how this sounds, but hear me out. What I'm asking of you is unusual, but in return, I'll make sure you never have to fight to survive again. No more cold, no more hunger, no more uncertainty." The woman leaned back and crossed her arms. Her sharp, critical eyes never left his face. "Okay, you've got my attention. What do you want?" Lucas set his coffee cup down and took a deep breath. This was the moment. He knew he had to phrase it carefully. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. But just when you thought this story couldn't get any stranger, Lucas spoke the words that would turn her world upside down. "I want you to carry a child for me," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The woman blinked a few times, as if she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. Then she burst into a dry, mocking laugh. "A child?" she repeated slowly, shaking her head. "You're insane." Lucas held her gaze, his expression unchanging. Just when you thought it couldn't get any stranger, he said, "I know how it sounds, but this is not a joke. I want an heir, someone to carry on my legacy. I've tried the traditional way, but it hasn't worked. You can help me, and in return, I'll make sure you get a completely new life." "This is the most absurd, arrogant— What makes you so special that you think you can demand this from someone?" she said bitterly, her voice laced with sharp sarcasm. Lucas let her vent, his face remaining impassive. When she finally stopped, he spoke again, his tone steady and resolute. "Because I'm offering you something no one else will," he said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "A way out. Think about it. What has life given you so far? What if you could use this to change everything?" She stayed silent, her fingers wrapped tightly around the coffee cup, though she still hadn't touched it. Her gaze drifted outside to the rain streaming against the windows. The silence was almost unbearable, but Lucas knew he had to let her think. "And what happens after the child is born?" she finally asked, her voice softer now. Her eyes were still wary, like those of someone who didn't trust easily. Lucas leaned in closer. "After the birth, you'll get what we agree upon. Enough money to rebuild your life. Then you're free. No obligations, no contact, unless you want it." She narrowed her eyes, her expression a mix of skepticism and doubt. "And what if I say no?" Lucas shrugged, as if it didn't matter to him. "Then I'll take you back to where I found you," he said, his tone cold and determined, "and I'll move on. But I think you know this might be the only chance you'll ever get to break free." Just when you thought she might crumble under his words, her posture changed. What she said next would shift everything between them forever. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Lucas knew he couldn't force her, and he didn't want to. She had to choose for herself. "How do I know I can trust you?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "You don't," Lucas admitted, his eyes steady on hers. "But what do you have now? Nothing. You can take this gamble and win, or you can go back to the way things were. The choice is yours." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then suddenly, she stood up, and Lucas thought she was going to walk away. But instead, she looked straight at him, her gaze icy calm. "I need to think about it," she said simply. Lucas nodded and handed her a card. "You have 24 hours. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. "My name is Elena," she said. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into." She took the card without another word and walked out into the rain. Lucas remained seated, staring at the empty coffee cup in front of him. He wondered if he would ever see her again. But what he didn't know was that this encounter was the beginning of something that would change his entire world, and not in the way he had planned. The rain lasted all night. Droplets tapped relentlessly against the shelter where Elena had taken refuge. The park bench offered little protection from the cold, but she had nowhere else to go. Her worn-out shoes squelched with every movement, and her fingers trembled as she gripped Lucas's card. She stared at its simple design, just his name and number, nothing more. Yet the card felt heavier than she'd expected, as if it carried a promise she couldn't fully comprehend. What happened next took her by surprise. The thought that this small piece of paper could change her life made her feel both sick and hopeful at the same time. "Elena, you're crazy," she whispered to herself, her breath visible in the freezing air. She laughed bitterly. The sound was hollow, lost in the muffled patter of the rain. His words echoed in her mind. "You have nothing to lose." She gripped the card tighter and dropped her head. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of anger and longing. How dare he, she thought. Who does he think he is? A rich man who can buy anything, even my future. But then another thought crept in, soft but insidious. What if he's right? She looked at her hands, at the scars and rough skin that told the story of a life of struggle and survival. The streets had made her hard, but also empty. All she had was a sketchbook and pencils, and even those she could barely protect from the rain. She thought of the people who walked past her every day, their gazes filled with pity, or worse, indifference. What happened next was unexpected, even to herself. Something broke inside her. Not her pride, but the icy wall she had built around herself. She could keep fighting, every day a losing battle, or she could try something else. She looked at the card again, her breath trembling in the cold air. The night felt endless. She'd promised herself she'd throw the card away, but it remained pressed into her palm, as if refusing to be discarded. Every nervous thought was drowned out by another, even scarier one. What if I stay here, and this is all there will ever be? Eleanor looked at the dark streets around her, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She thought about the future, the bitter cold in her bones, the rumble of her empty stomach, the moment people would completely forget she existed. "What do you have now, Elena?" she asked herself again. What she didn't realize was that she had already taken her first step toward the inevitable. She took a deep breath, pulled the phone out of her pocket, and felt the cold metal in her hand. The rain seemed to intensify as she stared at the buttons. Her fingers hovered there, and for a moment she considered standing up and running away. But she didn't. At that moment, before she could stop herself, she dialed the first few numbers. The line rang. Once, twice. She could still hang up before anyone answered. She could pretend this had never happened. But before she knew it, she heard his voice. "This is Lucas." His tone was professional, cool, but there was something else. A sense of expectation, as though he knew she would call. Her throat felt dry, but she forced herself to speak. "It's Elena," she said softly, her voice quieter than she intended. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then his voice came through, slightly softer now. "I'm glad you called." What happened next surprised her. The words left her mouth sharper than she'd meant. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she shot back. "I want to talk, nothing more." "I'm not asking for anything else," Lucas replied, and in his voice there was a strange calmness that put her on edge. "Where are you? I'll send my driver." The black car rolled slowly to a stop in front of a large, stately house on the edge of the city. The building was imposing, with dark stone and tall windows that gave nothing away about what lay inside. The gardens were perfectly manicured, but the neatly trimmed hedges only added to the cold, unwelcoming feel. Elena stepped out of the car and looked up. Her breath was visible in the cold air, her heart pounding unevenly in her chest. This was no ordinary house, it was a fortress, a place that seemed as inaccessible as the man who lived there. But at that moment, just as she thought she might turn and leave, she forced her feet to move forward. The front door swung open before she could knock. There stood Lucas, his silhouette outlined sharply against the warm light spilling from the hallway. He wore his usual calm expression, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that she couldn't ignore. "You're here," he said simply, as if he'd known she would come. Eleanor stood at the threshold, her gaze fixed on him. "I'm here for answers, Lucas," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I promise you one thing. I won't be used." Lucas nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. It wasn't condescending, it was almost respectful. "That's all I ask," he replied. "Come inside." What she didn't realize was that this moment was the threshold to a life she could never have predicted. With one last look at the cold, dark landscape behind her, Eleanor stepped inside the house. The heavy door closed with a soft but final sound. And with that, there was no turning back. Eleanor followed him into a spacious living room. She tried to hide her surprise, but Lucas noticed. "Not bad, is it?" he said with a slight smile. She shrugged. "A beautiful view changes nothing." "Maybe not," Lucas admitted, motioning to a chair, "but it helps you see things in perspective." She sat down, her back straight, her gaze fixed on him. "I'm here for answers, not to be impressed by your wealth." Lucas smiled faintly and took a seat across from her. "I respect that. Ask what you need to know." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Why me? There are thousands of women who would line up for this. Why pick someone you literally found on the street?" What Lucas revealed next left her momentarily speechless. "Precisely because of that," Lucas answered immediately. His voice was calm, but his gaze was intense. "You have nothing. No hidden agenda, no history holding you back. That makes you honest, and honesty is something I need." "Honesty," she repeated mockingly. "It's interesting that a man who has everything suddenly values something he can't buy." Lucas nodded, as though accepting her point. "Maybe I'm trying to learn something I don't understand yet." "And what's that?" she challenged. "Trust," he said simply. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Elena felt her resistance waver. But what happened next would forever change the dynamic between them. "And what if I say no?" Lucas took a deep breath, as though he had already expected this answer. "Then we take you back. No consequences, no hard feelings." She kept staring at him, searching his expression. Finally, she leaned back and folded her arms. "I want to set my own conditions," she said calmly. Lucas raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by her words. "What do you mean?" "If I do this," Elena said firmly, "I want guarantees. No empty promises, no grey areas. If you don't hold up your end of the deal, I retain full control over the child." Lucas stared at her, his face tight. It was clear he hadn't seen this coming, but he refused to lose his composure. "That's a big risk for me," he said at last. "Just as this is a big risk for me," Elena shot back. "So what's it going to be?" At that moment, Lucas knew he had no choice. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Lucas held her gaze as though trying to see through her. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Fine, you'll get what you're asking for. But remember this, Elena, mistakes are not allowed. Not by me, and not by you." Eleanor gave a faint smile, her gaze icy. "I expect nothing less." Lucas stood up, extended his hand and said, "From now on, we work together. Let's see what we can build." What followed wouldn't just change her life, but Lucas's as well, in ways neither of them could have foreseen. The apartment Lucas had arranged for her was spacious and modern. The furniture was simple yet elegant, and the large windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Still, to Eleanor, it felt more like a carefully controlled prison than a new beginning. Everything was perfect, too perfect. She wandered through the space, letting her fingers slide over the smooth wooden furniture. Her sketch pad sat on the table, a small reminder of who she was before entering this world. She wanted to draw, but her thoughts were everywhere except on her art. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, Lucas stood there, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. He carried a stack of papers in his hand and stepped inside without hesitation. "Elena," he began, placing the papers on the table. "This is the contract. Everything we discussed is in here. Read it, and if you agree, sign it." She looked at the papers as if they were a time bomb. "You really are a man of details, aren't you?" she said with a hint of sarcasm. "That's how I handle everything," Lucas replied coolly. "Without clear agreements, misunderstandings happen, and we can't afford that." She sat down and picked up the first page. Her eyes scanned the lines, and the corners of her mouth curled slightly at some of the technical phrasing. Just when it seemed the tension might ease, Eleanor made an unexpected comment that complicated things further. "So I'm officially a project now?" she asked mockingly. Lucas didn't respond immediately. He stood there, his hands loosely in his pockets, but his eyes were fixed sharply on her. "You're much more than that," he said finally. "But this project is how we make sure you get what you deserve." His words, meant to reassure her, made her doubt more than she wanted to admit. She continued reading, her breathing slow and controlled as she carefully took it all in. When she reached the final page, she picked up the pen Lucas had left for her. "Elena," he said suddenly, his tone softer now, "are you sure you want this? There's no turning back once you sign." She looked up and held his gaze. "You said I had nothing to lose, right?" Her voice was steady, but somewhere in her eyes was a flicker of uncertainty. "Let's find out." With a swift, resolute motion, she signed her name. The ink dried as she set the pen down, and Lucas nodded. He picked up the papers, his face tight but somehow relieved. "The process starts tomorrow," he said as he walked to the door. "I'll make sure everything is in place. For now, try to relax." "Relax," she repeated softly, more to herself than to him. She smiled bitterly. "We'll see." Just when it seemed everything was clear and Lucas was in control, a thought flashed through Eleanor's mind. What if this is a mistake? What if he's hiding more than he lets on? The next morning, a medical team arrived at the apartment. They were polite but distant, their white coats and professional demeanor making it clear this was strictly business. Elena felt like an object rather than a person as they conducted tests and gave her instructions about what to expect with her body. Lucas was there too. He stood at a distance, his arms crossed, observing every step of the procedure. It was as though he needed to make sure nothing would go wrong, not with her and certainly not with his plan. "Everything is going according to schedule," the head doctor said as he handed Lucas a folder. "We expect no complications, but we'll monitor everything closely." "That's what I want to hear," Lucas replied curtly. He turned to Eleanor, who sat in a chair with her arms folded. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged, her face unreadable. "I'm here, aren't I? What does it matter how I feel?" Lucas narrowed his eyes slightly but said nothing. He knew he still had to earn her trust, and that would take time. Just when the conversation seemed to stall, their eyes met, and in hers, Lucas saw something he hadn't expected. Not just distrust, but a glimpse of deeply buried anger. The kind of anger that only comes from someone who has been betrayed too many times. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance between control and chaos. Lucas kept everything tightly managed, while Eleanor increasingly questioned what she had signed up for. She was given everything she needed: comfort, security, even a few new pencils and sketch pads. But despite it all, she still felt trapped in a world that wasn't hers. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked one evening as they sat in the living room together. Lucas leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her. "I thought I already explained." You tried, Elena replied, but I still don't believe it's that simple. He sighed and looked away, his eyes drifting to the view of the city. Maybe I'm trying to find something I never had, he said quietly. An heir is just part of that. His words struck something in her, but she refused to let it show. Maybe, she said simply, but I hope for your sake that it's enough. The tension between them was palpable, but somewhere in that tension, something else began to grow. A fragile mutual understanding. Lucas learned that Elena wasn't someone he could simply control, and Elena discovered that beneath Lucas's cool exterior was a man struggling with his own shortcomings. When the first medical results came in, the doctor smiled cautiously. Everything looks good, he said. The procedure can move forward. Elena looked at Lucas, who nodded as though this was the only answer he would accept. But in his eyes, she saw something different, doubt, perhaps even fear. For the first time, she realized he was taking just as much of a risk as she was. What happened next would completely upend not only their partnership, but also their personal lives. Because just when they thought they had everything under control, an unexpected discovery would shake everything to its core. The morning began with the soft patter of rain against the windows. Eleanor sat in a large chair by the window, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea. The silence in the apartment was heavy, almost unbearable. She had always thought that a comfortable life would bring peace, but now it felt more like a cage. Lucas's promise still echoed in her mind. Everything would be taken care of. Everything would run smoothly. But why did it feel like something was wrong? As she took a sip of her tea, she couldn't stop thinking, what if this is a mistake? What if there's more going on than he's letting on? Just when you thought she might calm herself, her attention was drawn to a flicker of movement in the shadows of the apartment. A flash of doubt crossed her mind, but before she could dwell on it, the doorbell rang. Lucas arrived right on time, as always. He stepped into the apartment with his usual confidence, but Eleanor noticed something different about his demeanor. His shoulders were stiffer, his gaze sharper. Behind him came Dr. Gray, a woman with a professional air who left nothing to chance. Eleanor, Lucas began, gesturing toward a chair. This is Dr. Gray. She'll be overseeing the medical process from now on. Eleanor gave a short nod, her eyes fixed on the woman. Dr. Gray extended her hand. Pleased to meet you, Ms. Elena. Everything has been prepared, and we'll go through the process step by step. Eleanor shook her hand hesitantly and sat down. As Dr. Gray began talking about protocols, medical tests, and the care she would receive, Eleanor could feel the tension in the room growing. It was as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what was to come. And what happens if there are complications? Elena asked suddenly, her voice flat but sharp. Complications are extremely rare, Dr. Gray replied professionally. Everything is proceeding according to schedule. But just when you thought she had reassured her, Elena caught a flicker of something in Lucas's expression, a hint of unease he couldn't quite hide. What else is he hiding, she wondered. That evening, Lucas sat in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stared out at the lights of the city, as though searching for answers in the horizon. Elena stood in the doorway, watching him silently before stepping inside. You're quiet, she said. That doesn't happen often. Lucas turned his head slowly to look at her. Some things deserve silence. Like what? Eleanor asked, sitting next to him. Her tone was challenging, but her eyes were curious. Lucas took a deep breath and sipped his whiskey. Like why I'm really doing this? I thought as much, she said softly. And? Lucas was silent for a moment. It's not just about an heir, he finally began, his voice softer than usual, almost fragile. It's about my sister, Sophia. Sophia? Eleanor asked cautiously. Lucas looked at her, and for the first time, his unshakable facade seemed to crack. She was everything I'm not, he said slowly. Warm, empathetic. She always wanted a family, but life didn't give her that chance. She died too young. How? Lucas swallowed. A rare illness. She wasn't even prepared for it, and there was nothing I could do but watch her slip away. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with emotion. Eleanor wanted to say something, anything meaningful, but before she could, Lucas continued. This child, he said softly, isn't just for me, it's for her. a way to carry on her legacy, to bring something of her back into the world. Just when you thought Elena might soften at his honesty, she looked at him sharply and said, "And do you really think this will be enough? A child won't fill the emptiness you feel." Lucas smiled faintly without joy. "I don't know, but it's better than trying nothing at all." 2 months later, the day started quietly until the medical team arrived with a new ultrasound. Elena sat silently while Lucas stood across from her, arms crossed. Dr. Gray placed the ultrasound images on the table and looked at both of them. "We have good news," she began professionally, "but there's an unexpected twist." "What is it?" Lucas asked, his voice tight. Dr. Gray pushed the image toward them. "You're not carrying one child, Ms. Elena. It's two, twins." Suddenly the room seemed smaller. Elena froze in her chair, her eyes fixed on the ultrasound. Lucas stood motionless, as if he wasn't sure how to react. "Twins?" Elena repeated, her voice soft. "Yes," Dr. Gray said, pointing at the screen. "Both appear healthy, but this means we'll need to adjust our planning." Just when you thought Lucas would maintain his usual calm, his eyes gleamed with an emotion he rarely let show. He stared at the ultrasound as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Two," he whispered, "two children." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her breathing uneven. How can this be, she thought. Everything that was already difficult now seemed even more complicated. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Lucas looked at her, and for the first time he seemed genuinely uncertain. "We'll adapt," he said finally, his voice low but resolute, "no matter what." But what no one knew was that this revelation would raise more questions than answers. The weeks following the revelation of the twins were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustments. Eleanor had promised herself to keep her walls high, but the more time passed, the more she felt overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. The thought that two lives were now entirely dependent on her began to consume her. Lucas appeared to meet the change with outward calm, but Elena saw the small cracks in his facade. He was quieter than usual, often lost in thought. She caught him staring at the ultrasound images more than once, as if trying to grasp the enormity of what was at stake. Just when you thought they were starting to settle into this new reality, Lucas made a proposal that completely caught Elena off guard. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the living room, but the light felt cold and impersonal. Elena sat in the oversized chair by the window, a cup of tea clutched tightly in her hands. The silence of the house was stifling. She had never imagined that a life of comfort could feel so suffocating. She looked up when Lucas suddenly entered. His steps were purposeful, his expression composed, but there was tension in his posture she hadn't noticed before. He hesitated just long enough for her to see it, and then he spoke. "This might surprise you, but we need to talk," he began, his voice cooler than he likely intended. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, looking at him with mild irritation. "That always sounds promising." Lucas stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on her. Then he took a deep breath and sat down across from her. His hands rested on his knees, but they looked tense, as if he wanted to clench them. What happened next was something she hadn't seen coming. "I think," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that it's better if you move here." Eleanor froze and stared at him. "Move here? Why? That wasn't part of the agreement, Lucas." "I know," he said quickly, but she heard something in his voice. Doubt. That surprised her. "But the situation has changed. This isn't just about you and me anymore." He looked away for a moment, his gaze fixed on the space behind her, as though trying to escape his own words. "It's about them." "Every time you say that," Elena replied sharply, setting her tea down, "it sounds like they're a business transaction." Lucas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then the silence stretched, and what he said next completely unbalanced her. "Elena, listen," he said softly. "I want to do this right, but I don't know how. I'm used to having control over everything. This," he gestured toward her stomach, his gaze softening briefly, "this is different." Eleanor looked at him, her posture still defensive, but something in his tone reached her. "So you think the solution is to stick us under one roof?" she asked. "I think it's a start," he admitted. His voice was steady, but his gaze revealed a crack in his armor. Just when she thought he was asking for control again, he revealed a glimpse of his true self. "I can't always be there if you're somewhere else, and I don't want to risk anything going wrong." "So that's it," she said with a sigh, leaning back. "Control." Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes harder now. "Maybe it is, but that doesn't mean I'm doing it just for myself." He paused, as though preparing to say more, but hesitated. Finally, it came out. "This isn't just about the twins, it's about you too." "Me?" Eleanor asked skeptically. He nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "Yes, because I care about what happens." He stood up as though the words had physically exhausted him and took a few steps away from her chair. What he did next completely threw her off. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice softer. Lucas turned back to her and nodded, visibly relieved though he tried to hide it. "That's all I'm asking." That afternoon, an envelope arrived that immediately shifted the mood in the house. Lucas opened it with his usual calm, but Eleanor noticed the tension in his shoulders as he read the letter. "What is it?" she asked, watching him from across the room. Lucas slowly folded the letter and looked at her, his expression firm. "The foundation. They're coming for an inspection in 2 weeks." Just when you thought the situation couldn't get any more complicated, he laid out the full weight of it. Elena felt a cold chill down her spine. "So soon?" "Apparently, they want to ensure we're taking this seriously." He stepped toward her, his face set. "We need to be ready, Elena. No mistakes." She sighed and shook her head. "Why am I not surprised that you see this as an exam?" Lucas stared at her silently. His gaze was firm, but there was something behind it, something she couldn't quite place. "If we fail, they pay the price," he said finally, "and I won't let that happen." The days that followed were a mix of preparations and underlying tension. Lucas brought in help to make everything perfect, the house, the routine, even their interactions. But every now and then, Eleanor saw something that surprised her. Moments when he stopped to look at the nursery being set up, or when his hand rested on the wooden crib that had just been delivered. What happened next would change her view of him forever. One evening, she found him there, staring at the crib as though having a conversation with someone who wasn't there. He didn't even hear her enter the room. "Lucas?" she asked softly. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second she saw something in his eyes. Doubt, maybe even fear. "I never thought I'd be here," he said quietly, his fingers running along the edge of the crib. "The idea of a family." He paused, swallowing hard. It was always too big, too uncontrollable. "And now?" Eleanor asked, her voice cautious. Lucas turned to face her. "Now I'm trying to figure out how to protect something I've never had before." Just when you thought he would hide his emotions again, he gave a glimpse of his heart. His words touched her deeper than she wanted to admit. "You don't have to do everything alone," she finally said, and she knew she meant it. Lucas looked at her, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's what I still need to learn." The days in Lucas's house drifted by in a rhythm that felt too tightly controlled. The enormous rooms and hallways were impressive, but there was no warmth. Only silence, broken occasionally by the soft cries of the twins or the faint echo of Elena's footsteps against the marble floors. Because just when you thought she had finally found peace, Elena realized how heavy the weight of expectations truly was. She sat in the garden, her sketchbook resting on her lap. The garden was perfect, like everything else here. Not a shrub too large, not a flower out of place. Eleanor took a deep breath, staring at the blank sheet of paper. She used to spend hours drawing, unconcerned with time or the judgment of others. But here, in Lucas's world, it felt as though even her silence was being scrutinized. She drew a line, rough and uncontrolled, as if the paper needed to absorb her frustration. "Hey!" Lucas's voice suddenly came from behind her, his shadow falling over the paper. "We need to talk." Eleanor looked up and saw him, dressed in his ever-present tailored suit, as though he never allowed himself a moment to relax. "What is it now?" she asked curtly, snapping the sketchbook shut. Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "The inspection has been moved up. It's in 2 weeks." Eleanor stared at him, the words slowly sinking in. 2 weeks, she repeated. "Why so soon?" "The foundation wants confirmation that everything is proceeding as planned." His tone was all business, but his posture betrayed something else. Even he seemed tense, though he would never admit it. They can't have any reason to doubt us. Eleanor felt her muscles tighten. She stood up, meeting Lucas's gaze with fire in her own. And what happens if they do? Lucas's expression darkened. Then they could consider taking custody. It felt as if the ground shifted beneath her feet. Custody, she whispered, her voice raw. Yes. His gaze was firm, unyielding. That's why we won't let it happen. That night, Elena lay awake in her room. The silence of the house was deafening. Her thoughts raced, the words custody and perfect image echoing through her mind. It felt like an invisible rope tightening around her neck, inch by inch. She looked at her sketchbook lying on the bedside table. Without thinking, she picked it up and opened it. Her pencil began to move. At first, it was just stray lines, but soon it became something more. A drawing of a bird, trapped in a cage too large and too empty. Just when you thought she would give in to despair, something unexpected happened. She ripped the page out, crumpled it, and threw it away. This wasn't who she was, not anymore. The days that followed were a surreal exercise in performance. Lucas had hired a coach to teach them family interactions, moments that were meant to look natural. Eleanor couldn't take it anymore. "Stop," she said sharply when the coach asked them to practice a bedtime scenario. She stood up and stormed out of the room. Lucas followed her and found her on the veranda, staring out at the garden. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "This doesn't feel real," she said without looking at him. "How do you expect us to convince them when we can't even convince ourselves?" Lucas remained silent for a moment. "Because we don't have another choice," he said finally. "If you know a better way, tell me." Elena turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "Maybe we should stop pretending. Maybe we should just be honest." Lucas looked at her, and what happened next surprised her. His eyes, usually so cold and calculating, showed a flicker of something else. Doubt, maybe even hope. "Honesty," he repeated. "I don't know if that will be enough." It felt like she was finally catching her breath until Clara, Lucas's cousin, arrived. From the moment Clara extended her hand, Elena knew something was off. Her questions were too sharp, her smile too polite. She was impeccably dressed, her demeanor as polished as her appearance. "Elena," she said with a pleasant smile, extending her hand, "I heard about the inspection. I thought you might need some help." "Clara is familiar with the foundation," Lucas explained. "She can offer valuable advice." That evening, Eleanor confronted Lucas. "She's not here to help, is she?" she asked sharply. Lucas looked at her, and there was no evasion in his gaze. "She wants to protect the legacy, not us." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her. This wasn't just Lucas's fight anymore. It was hers too. "If this is a game," she said softly but firmly, "then I'll play. But on my terms." Lucas looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Respect. Just when you thought Eleanor would crumble under the pressure, she found a new determination. This was her moment to be stronger than ever before. The day of the inspection dawned under a grey sky. The house felt quieter than usual, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, staring down at her growing belly. Hidden beneath layers of fabric and skin, they were already there. Her children. She felt them sometimes, soft movements, almost as if they were saying, "We're here, Mama." The word Mama did something to her. She wasn't one yet, not really, but the thought that two lives depended on her became more real with every passing day. "Today is about control," Lucas had said that morning. "We're leaving nothing to chance." Eleanor's sharp gaze met his. "You can't control everything, Lucas. That's your biggest blind spot." But before she thought her words might touch him, he turned abruptly and walked away, as he always did. The inspectors arrived promptly at 10. 2 women and a man, dressed in sharp suits, their eyes missing nothing. Eleanor greeted them as calmly as she could, though she felt her heart pounding in her chest. They mustn't see anything, no doubt, no mistakes. As Lucas guided them through the house, Eleanor followed in silence. The questions began quickly, direct, sharp, leaving no room for evasive answers. "How have you experienced the pregnancy so far?" one of the women suddenly asked. Her voice was polite, but her eyes pierced through Eleanor's calm facade. Eleanor placed a protective hand on her belly. She thought back to the moment she saw the first ultrasound. 2 tiny, flickering heartbeats. She hadn't understood the image at first, not until the doctor explained. In that split second, her world had changed. "I never thought it would feel like this," she answered softly, her words more honest than she intended. "It's overwhelming. But when they move, when I hear their heartbeats, I know I'm not doing this just for myself." Just when you thought her answer was enough, the woman continued, "And your relationship with Mr. Marshall? How has that partnership been?" Eleanor looked at Lucas, who stood across the room. His shoulders were tense, his expression unreadable. "We have our differences," she admitted, "but the twins come first. On that, we stand on the same side." The hardest moment came when one of the inspectors asked, "What will you do if complications arise? Are you prepared for the unexpected?" Eleanor took a slow breath. Complications. Her thoughts flashed to the night she woke up in panic, a sharp pain in her belly. Fear had gripped her, but when she whispered softly to her unborn children, she felt their reassuring movements no one else could provide. "I know there are risks," she replied, her voice steady and determined. "But I'll make sure they get everything they need, no matter what happens." What happened next surprised her. Lucas spoke, his tone softer than she expected. "We understand the responsibility," he said, "but this isn't a project. These are my children, and I'm certain we can face this together." Eleanor glanced at him, searching for signs of sincerity. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before, a glimpse of uncertainty, maybe even fear. And just when you thought he would hide that emotion, he held her gaze as if admitting that he wasn't the only one struggling with what lay ahead. When the inspectors finally left, Eleanor sank onto the couch, exhausted. She rubbed her belly gently, a quiet gesture of comfort for them, and for herself. Lucas stood silently in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the front door as though he was trying to reclaim the control he'd briefly lost. "How do you think it went?" he asked finally. Eleanor sighed, her fingers still resting on her belly. "Like an exam. But I think we passed, for now." Lucas nodded. "This was only the first step. There's more to come." "Is that all this will ever be?" Eleanor asked, looking up at him. "More pressure, more expectations. When does it stop, Lucas?" "Maybe it never does," he admitted, his voice rough, more honest than she was used to. "But that doesn't mean we give up." That evening, as the house grew quiet and dusk settled over the garden, Eleanor sat on the balcony. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, her thoughts a chaotic storm. A sudden kick from her belly pulled her from her reverie. She gasped softly, surprised and moved at the same time. "Easy, little ones," she whispered. Her hand slid over her belly, searching for the feeling again, and there it was. A small flutter, as if they wanted to remind her they were there. Lucas's voice broke the silence. "Everything okay?" he asked as he stepped onto the balcony. Eleanor didn't look up. "I felt them move," she said quietly. "They just reminded me they're here." Lucas didn't say anything. He watched her, how she held her belly, and something in his demeanor shifted. For a moment, it seemed like he realized this wasn't just about his children. There was a connection growing, one he could neither buy nor command. "They're lucky," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. Elena looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "They have you," Lucas replied, "and that means more than you think." What happened next felt different. Elena looked up at the stars, at the infinite sky above them, and for the first time since coming to this house, she felt something warm. Not for Lucas, but for herself, for them. The C-section had been scheduled weeks in advance. Lucas had insisted that everything be arranged down to the smallest detail, the medical team, the preparations, even the timing. Nothing was to be left to chance, but for Elena it felt as though nothing could truly prepare her for what was to come. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if something went wrong? The days leading up to the procedure were a blur of tension and activity. Doctors had explained every step of the process, yet the knot in her stomach remained. Lucas was everywhere, observing, controlling, present. Yet it wasn't his sharp gaze that reassured her. It was a simple, soft sentence he had spoken the night before. "No matter what happens, I'm here." Now, on the morning of the surgery, a strange stillness hung in the air. The house seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, her restless hands gliding over her belly. A wave of fear shot through her at the thought that this would be the last time she felt their kicks. Lucas entered, his shoulders tense, but his eyes softer than expected. He hesitated for a moment at the doorway before walking to her and kneeling down. "It's time," he said softly. Eleanor looked at him, her voice trembling. "Do you think we're ready for this?" He took her hand firmly, but his grip was warmer than she had ever felt. "No one's ever really ready, Elena," he admitted honestly, "but what I do know is that we're doing this together." For the first time, a sense of calm washed over her, as if his words were an anchor keeping her grounded. The hospital felt clinical and distant, the smell of disinfectant hanging heavily in the air. Elena lay on the operating table, Lucas standing at her side in a surgical gown pulled over his carefully chosen suit. He had always been in control, but now his eyes betrayed him. For the first time, he was just an observer, powerless. "It's starting," Dr. Gray said calmly. The sound of metal instruments filled the room, and Eleanor forced herself to breathe. She couldn't feel anything, but her mind was spinning. How would it feel, the moment she saw their faces for the first time? Just as the silence became unbearable, the first cry rang out, high, clear, and raw. "The first baby," Dr. Gray announced, a smile on her face. "A boy." Eleanor's chest seemed to swell with emotions she couldn't name. Tears stung her eyes as she tried to speak, but her voice failed her. How could she ever find the words to describe this feeling? And then, seconds later, there was another cry, softer but just as powerful. "And here's the second," Dr. Gray continued. "A girl, 2 beautiful, healthy babies." The sound of their cries shattered something inside Elena. The months of tension melted away, as though she was finally allowing herself to feel it all. Tears streamed freely down her face as she reached out, desperate to see them. Lucas paced outside the operating room, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His world seemed to shift the moment he heard his children's cries. The sound pulled him back to a memory he had tried to bury, a flash of his sister Sophia lying in a hospital bed. Her smile weak but loving. "Make sure you leave something behind, Lucas," she had whispered once. "Something real, not just your name." When a nurse appeared with a broad smile, Lucas looked up. "They're doing well," she said. "Would you like to see them?" The room where the babies lay was silent, save for the soft sounds of their breathing. Lucas approached the bassinets hesitantly, staring down at them. The boy slept peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling. The girl lay with her small hands outstretched, as if already trying to grasp the world around her. Lucas's throat felt dry as he leaned forward. His hand trembled slightly as he gently touched his son's cheek. "Perfect," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He had thought this moment would be a victory, another completed plan. But what he felt now was something else. This wasn't legacy. This was life, real and fragile. Later that evening, Elena woke up in a quiet room, the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminating her surroundings. The first thing she saw was Lucas sitting beside her, holding a baby in each arm. His face was softer now, his expression distant as he gazed down at them. "They didn't want to wake you," he whispered. "But I couldn't wait." Eleanor smiled weakly, reaching out her arms. Lucas stood carefully, as though holding glass, and placed the boy in her arms. The girl remained tucked against his chest, still asleep. In that moment, as Elena held her son for the first time, the world seemed to stand still. His skin was warm and soft against her, his tiny fists trembling slightly. She looked at him, her heart filling in a way she had never experienced before. "They're perfect," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Lucas looked up from their daughter and nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "And they need us." He paused, looking at Elena with something like recognition. "That makes us a family." "A family," The word sounded strange and familiar at the same time. But in that moment, it felt right. That night, there was no control, no strategy, only their new reality. The babies grew restless, their soft cries filling the room. Eleanor tried to sit up, but a sharp pain held her back. Lucas immediately stood, without hesitation. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. She watched as he moved with clumsy but careful hands, preparing bottles and rocking them gently. His face was focused, his movements tender. This wasn't Lucas Marshall, the businessman. This was a father. As the twins finally settled back to sleep, Eleanor felt something shift. This wasn't the end of a transaction. This was a beginning. A beginning they would face together, not as strangers, but as a family. The days following the twins' birth were a mixture of joy and chaos. The house, once a pristine display of control and order, was now filled with the soft cries of babies, the rustle of caretakers moving quietly, and a new kind of silence that felt both like a promise and a threat. Eleanor sat at the edge of the bed, her gaze fixed on her daughter's sleeping face. Her tiny fists rested against her cheek as though she were comforting herself. An unfamiliar warmth filled Eleanor's chest, something she didn't dare name yet. Meanwhile, to Elena's surprise, Lucas seemed to be adapting to his role as a father faster than she'd expected. Yet in the corners of his actions, she saw the telltale signs of his internal struggle. Just when you thought Lucas was fully in control, a single gesture revealed that he was still battling his own uncertainties. One night, while Eleanor fed their son, she heard movement in the adjoining room. Curious, she peered through the doorway and saw Lucas hunched over their daughter's crib, his fingers hesitantly brushing along the edge of the blanket. He said nothing, but his tense shoulders revealed the weight of the moment, as if he was trying to understand something far beyond himself. Seeing him like that changed something in her. He wasn't just the man of steel and glass she'd known. Here was someone visibly adjusting to something he could not control. The next morning, the fragile calm shattered when Clara arrived unannounced. Her presence was as impeccable as always, but her gaze swept through the room critically, as though searching for cracks in the surface. "They look good," she said clinically, her eyes resting on the sleeping twins. "But this is only the beginning." Lucas, who had been standing silently in the doorway, stepped forward. His jaw tightened, his fingers tapping impatiently against his arm. "Why are you here, Clara?" Clara turned to him, her smile sharp as a knife. "I'm here because the foundation is ready for the next step. You've proven you can start this, but now they want to see that you can sustain it." Her gaze shifted to Elena. "If there's even the slightest doubt about your stability..." She let the words hang in the air, and Eleanor's heart raced. "What do you mean by that?" she asked sharply. Clara held her gaze, unflinching. What happened next pulled the last bit of calm from under them. In the worst-case scenario, they can demand external oversight, or split custody with someone they deem more suitable. "That's not happening," Lucas said immediately, his voice low and loaded. Still, Eleanor noticed his hand clench into a fist before he forced it to relax. "How long do we have?" he asked after a beat of silence. 2 weeks, Clara replied, her expression hard. "Make the most of it." That evening, Lucas and Elena sat in the kitchen. The baby monitor rested between them, the soft coos of the twins filling the heavy silence. "What are we going to do?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice quiet but tense. Lucas, his fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee, looked up at her. His face was stern, but his eyes betrayed something else. Doubt. "We make sure they find nothing," he said at last. "No weak spots, no mistakes." Eleanor shook her head. "That's easy for you to say," she shot back. "But this isn't a performance, Lucas. This is about them." Her eyes flickered to the baby monitor. Lucas placed his cup down and leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. Just when you thought he would remain unyielding, a flicker of hesitation broke through his voice. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly, his eyes holding hers longer than usual. "But we don't have a choice, Elena. If we fail, they're the ones who pay the price." His voice nearly broke on the last words, but he recovered quickly. Elena noticed it. He was strong, but not unbreakable. "And how do we show them we're a family, Lucas?" she asked, her voice softer now. "How can we show that if we aren't one?" Lucas stared at her, his fingers unconsciously tracing the rim of his mug. He seemed on the verge of saying something, but swallowed it down. Maybe, he began hesitantly, what happened next would change everything between them. Maybe we need to change that, he finished, his voice barely audible. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. What do you mean by that? He took a deep breath, as though suppressing something. I know this didn't start that way, but maybe it's time we stop doing this just for them. Maybe we need to do it for us, too. Eleanor felt her heart beat faster at his words. For the first time, something genuine slipped into his voice, something he had kept hidden until now. The days that followed felt different. Their partnership no longer felt forced. Lucas was there, really there. He still had his moments of control, of unnecessary perfection, but there were also other moments. A small smile when Eleanor spoke to the twins, a softened expression when he rocked his son to sleep at night. It was those small moments that made Eleanor realize something was shifting, not just in her, but in him too. But the days ahead wouldn't be without their challenges, challenges that would either bring them closer together or tear them apart forever. The day of the inspection began under a heavy silence. The house felt charged, absorbing every ounce of nervous energy. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, her fingers trembling slightly as she checked the bottles. Each routine action grounded her, if only temporarily. Lucas paced through the living room, his gaze fixed on every detail. He straightened a cushion, inspected a photo frame, and wiped an invisible mark from the table. But just when you thought he was entirely in control, there it was. His hand briefly raking through his hair, a telltale sign of the unrest he usually hid so well. When the doorbell rang, the sound sliced through the walls like a blade. Eleanor took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door. There stood the inspectors, 2 women and 1 man, all wrapped in the kind of neutrality that was more intimidating than outright hostility. "Good morning," said the senior inspector, his voice polite but clipped. "Good morning," Elena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Lucas appeared beside her immediately, his presence as unshakable as always. "Please come in," he said, motioning them toward the living room. But what happened next drew the tension even tighter. The senior inspector let his gaze sweep over the room, lingering a beat too long on the twins' bassinets and a framed photo. Eleanor felt the judgment, even though not a word had been spoken. The inspection began with a systematic tour of the house. The inspectors opened doors, scribbled notes, and asked questions that Elena found ridiculous, but she showed no sign of it. She felt their eyes constantly on her, while Lucas addressed them with measured patience. "How do you divide the childcare responsibilities?" asked the youngest inspector, a sharp-eyed woman whose face barely softened. Eleanor swallowed briefly, but answered calmly. "We work together. Lucas takes the mornings. I handle the nights. During the day, we share whatever's needed." Her hands were clasped in front of her, an invisible attempt to keep her nerves in check. The inspector hovered her pen over her paper, as though waiting for more. Lucas picked up smoothly, his voice controlled. "That's correct. We have a clear structure, but we step in where necessary. Our priority is making sure the children have everything they need." Just when you thought he was completely composed, a faint hesitation crept into his voice. His fingers tapped briefly on the table's edge, his eyes lingering on the inspector a moment too long. The inspectors exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. It felt like a test you didn't know how to pass. The hardest moment came at the end of the evaluation. The inspectors sat at the dining table, their folders open before them. The senior inspector looked at both of them in turn, his voice clinical. "You've indicated this is a joint responsibility," he began. "But what happens if disagreements arise over parenting? How do you ensure long-term stability?" Eleanor felt her heart hammer in her chest. The question was sharp and direct, but she knew she had to answer. "We communicate," she said steadily, refusing to avert her gaze. "We might not always agree on the approach, but we talk everything through, and we stay focused on what's best for the twins." The inspector turned his attention to Lucas. "Do you agree with that?" Lucas glanced briefly at Elena, and for the first time, he seemed to carefully weigh his words. Slowly, he nodded, though his jaw tensed before he replied. "Yes," he said softly. A short silence fell, as though he wanted to say more, but hesitated. But it goes beyond communication. This isn't just a temporary partnership. He paused, his gaze fixed on his clasped hands resting on the table. Then he looked up, his eyes resolute. This is a family. And a family means you don't let each other fall, no matter what happens. What happened next surprised Elena. His voice carried warmth, and the sincerity was unmistakable. For the first time, it didn't feel rehearsed, but like something straight from his heart. The senior inspector gave a curt nod and closed his folder. "Thank you for your transparency," he said. "We will share our findings with you in a week." When the inspectors finally left and the door clicked shut behind them, the air in the house seemed to breathe again. Eleanor collapsed onto the couch, her head in her hands. Lucas remained standing, staring at the closed door as though waiting for an unseen threat to return. "That went better than I expected," he mumbled eventually, his voice less certain than usual. Eleanor shot him a wry look. "I felt like I was taking an exam. And you?" Lucas sighed and sat beside her. Like everything was on the line, his fingers smoothed over his pant legs as though wiping away something invisible. Then he looked up and, to her surprise, offered her a faint smile. "You did well." Eleanor pulled her knees onto the couch, a fragile sense of relief bubbling up. But just when you thought they could relax, uncertainty lingered like a shadow in the corner of the room. The week that followed was filled with waiting. But it brought something else too, small moments that drew Elena and Lucas closer. Sleepless nights were less grueling when they traded off caring for the twins. Lucas learned how to soothe his daughter's cries with soft lullabies, something that surprised Elena, though she didn't dare mention it. Then came the call. Lucas answered while Elena watched anxiously. He listened, nodded, and finally said, "Thank you." He hung up and turned to her slowly. "What did they say?" she asked softly. Lucas hesitated for a moment, and in those few seconds, the world seemed to stop. Then a small smile crept onto his face. "They trust us. They see us as a suitable family." Elena let her head fall back, exhaling deeply. "Thank God." Lucas walked toward her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen. "This is a new beginning," he said quietly. "Not just for them, but for us." She looked up, searching his eyes. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, his hand slipping into his pocket. What happened next stole her breath away. A small velvet box appeared in his palm. "Elena," he began, his voice briefly unsteady before he recovered, "we've built something together. You've shown me I can change, and I don't want this to end. Will you be my wife?" The moment stretched as Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't place. Lucas held his breath, his hand trembling slightly as he held the box. But slowly her lips curved into a smile. "Yes," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Yes, I will." For a split second, Lucas's face shifted from pure relief to something softer, as though he'd finally won something he never thought possible. He smiled broadly, a rare sight, and his hands were careful and light as he slipped the ring onto her finger. That evening, under the starlit sky, the world felt different. They sat together in the garden, the air cool and crisp, while the twins slept peacefully inside. Eleanor stared at the ring on her finger, brushing her thumb over its cool surface as though still adjusting to its new weight. "A family," she said softly, her voice almost fragile as she tested the word, trying to see how it felt. Lucas turned to her, his gaze warm and open, so different from the man she'd first met. He nodded slowly. "Yes. And this—" He paused briefly, his eyes shining in the gentle light. "This is just the beginning." What followed wasn't just silence. For the first time, Eleanor felt she truly wasn't alone. Together, they had built something stronger than doubt or control. The garden around them was still, but in that moment, their lives finally seemed to breathe, free of what had come before. With that single moment, as the stars glimmered above them, they began a new chapter together. One full of promises, challenges, and the chance to finally build a home. The wedding was everything Eleanor could have wished for, simple, intimate, and free from the weight of Lucas's usual grandeur. The garden had been transformed into a romantic haven, with soft lights twinkling through the trees and white flowers lining the pathways. The scent of roses and lavender drifted through the air, while the gentle music of a string quartet created the perfect backdrop. But just when you thought it was an ordinary ceremony, it became something far greater, a reflection of where they had come from. The guest list was small, limited to close friends and family. Clara was there, impeccably dressed as always, but with a smile that for once seemed surprisingly genuine. A few of Lucas's old business associates mingled quietly, alongside people Eleanor barely knew. Yet the whispers of congratulations and smiles couldn't overshadow the significance of this moment. Lucas stood at the altar, dressed in a dark blue suit tailored to perfection. His usual confidence remained, but there was a new softness in his gaze, a look reserved only for Elena. Elena's dress was simple but enchanting. The silk fell gracefully around her, flowing like water with every step she took. Her hair was loosely pinned up, with a few curls framing her face. As she walked toward the altar, her heart pounded, not out of fear, but as an echo of everything they had overcome. She thought of the day she had unwillingly stepped into his world, never imagining he would one day become her home. Standing opposite Lucas, it felt as if the world fell silent. The stars above seemed to shine just for them. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was no tension, no doubt, only the two of them. What happened next, Eleanor would later think, was the moment everything finally fell into place. The priest spoke calmly, but with a warmth that even seemed to touch Lucas. The vows followed, and Lucas spoke first. He took Eleanor's hands in his voice softer than usual, but carrying the same unwavering strength. "Elena," he began, "I thought I knew everything about control, about plans and strategy. Then you came along. You showed me that some things can't be calculated. You taught me what it means to let go, to grow. And today I promise you that I will always keep learning, for you and for our family." He paused, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture so subtle only she would notice. Just when you thought Lucas's facade was unbreakable, the emotion in his eyes betrayed him. Eleanor swallowed and took a deep breath. "Lucas," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I thought I knew who you were when we first met. But I had no idea. You were cold, calculating, and you had everything you wanted within reach." She smiled faintly, her eyes shining. "And yet, beneath all of that, I found a man who wanted to learn how to trust. You're not just the one who protected me and our children. You showed me that I'm stronger than I ever believed. Today I promise you that I won't just stand beside you, I'll fight with you, no matter what comes." As the rings were exchanged and their fingers intertwined, the soft cry of the twins echoed from a shaded corner where a caretaker held them. Eleanor turned her head slightly and laughed gently. "They know this is for them," Lucas whispered, sliding the ring onto her finger. There was a tenderness in his voice that she had only rarely heard. The ceremony ended with a kiss that meant far more than a simple vow. It was a confirmation of their journey, of the sacrifices, the struggles, and the love that had slowly woven itself between them. The rest of the day felt like a dream, a blend of laughter, the soft clinking of glasses, and the peaceful atmosphere of a garden bathed in candlelight. There were no grand speeches, only small, intimate moments. Clara raised a glass in a quiet toast. "To a family that has shown what true growth looks like," she said, her eyes briefly meeting Lucas's. There was something soft in her expression that Elena hadn't seen before. "And to a future that can only get stronger." Later that evening, after the last of the guests had left, Eleanor and Lucas stood together beneath the starry sky. The lights above still twinkled, and the soft cries of their children echoed faintly from the house, a soothing rhythm. Lucas looked at her, his gaze warm and open. "So, Mrs. Marshall," he said with a rare smile, "how does it feel to start a new chapter?" Eleanor leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Like something I never expected," she said softly, "but exactly where I need to be." Lucas pressed a kiss to her forehead and looked up at the stars. "We've come a long way," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I thought I could control everything, but—" He looked down at her, a glimmer of something new in his eyes. "Some things you just have to let happen." Eleanor smiled and took his hand. And some things are worth the risk. Just when you thought their journey was complete, you realized this was only the beginning. A story they would keep writing together day by day. What would you do if you faced a choice that could change your entire life? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story.